Well, hello, welcome to the video. This one's about what it was really like running a pub rock venue in the 1980s. And I'm going to tell you straight after this. Right, first of all, let's go back a bit and just briefly say what is pub rock for those people who've been away and don't know what we're talking about. Basically, I contest there's always been music in London's pubs. Back in the days when they had music halls in there, then it was sing-alongs and all kinds of things. Even in the 1960s, there was the Manor House, which was the big venue, the whole of the top floor, which I think held about 800 people. That put on people like Fleetwood Mac and Jimi Hendrix, the Stones, all the big names of the time. And there were other venues like that. And don't forget that places like Clute's Cleek and the Moonlight Club were actually rooms in pubs. And so in 1971, I think it was, when Eggs Over Easy played at the Tally Ho, closely followed by Brinsley Schwartz, and Dave Robinson started the whole thing up. It was already going, they just accelerated it and made it larger. I started in the 1970s. I put on things at places like the White Lion Putney and the John Bull Chiswick, the first place I ever did. But we're really talking about my time in the 1980s, from 82 onwards, I suppose, at the Cricketers' Kennington Oval. Now, by this time, the whole thing had changed. In the early days, when the pub rock thing happened after the Eggs Over Easy thing, they normally didn't charge, and so the bands only got a small amount, a token amount. So they couldn't really sustain like lots of bands playing professionally. So they had to charge, and eventually they started charging to start with 50 pence and £1, only at weekends to start with, and then it became a thing. Some venues remained free, and they attracted a less higher standard of band, but the bands played in most pubs, they charged roughly the same. Every pub had its own atmosphere, which was partly to do with the person who booked the bands, because when it was free, it was the landlord or the manager of the pub that booked the bands. But as time went on, and by the time I went to the Cricketers, there was a whole group of us. There was me, there was Joe Pearson, a guy called Bill Knox, who did pubs in Putney and then moved on to the King's Head in Fulham. There was George Blevins up at the Torrington. I think back in the 1950s, he used to do jazz there. And Steve Beggs, who was at the Dublin Castle to start with and then went on to the 100 Club. And there were famously agents who booked pubs, such as the Albion Agency booked gigs at the Hope and Anchor, the Nashville, the Red Cow, and various other places. There was Mike Malley, who booked the gigs at the Golden Lion in Fulham. There was a woman called Kathy who booked the gigs at the Greyhound, though Duncan occasionally booked them himself, the landlord Duncan. And there's a guy, I can't remember his name, who booked bands for the Windsor Castle in the Harrow Road. And there was a guy called John Fat Beast in the 80s who did the gigs at the Bull and Gate, who was a very eccentric character and almost became part of bands' sets on stage and things. So we were one breed of people, and we specialised in not only booking the bands, that's only part of the job, but also getting people to the gigs, because it wasn't just a question of like book a band and then people turn up. You've got to get the listings into Time Out and the Music Press and the Evening Standard. People know who's playing, because back then, don't forget, no internet, and that made it harder, because when we were booking bands and things, it was purely by landline and face-to-face, which is a big part of it. And also a lot of stuff was sent by post, like bands would send you in tapes. This is the thing. And you would be inundated with tapes, and then the band would ring you up and be very disappointed that you didn't offer them a gig. But of course, it was an economic thing. The promoter, me, had to satisfy not only the bands, keep them happy, because obviously somebody like the big names like Steve Marriott and Wilco Johnson and Gino Washington and Desmond Decker can only play a certain number of gigs, and there were lots of pubs. So they tended to pick and choose. Sometimes it was who paid the most, but you couldn't pay them the most if you hadn't taken it on the door. So it was a question of like keeping the bands happy to a certain extent, appealing to them, giving them the PA they want, because if you haven't got the right PA, they don't like playing there, and so you won't get them back. And also the way they're treated by the manager of the pub, the bar staff, it's all like an organic thing. Carter, the unstoppable sex machine, we always got on very well. They kept playing at the Cricketers, but they said it wasn't really suited to what they did, even though the audience loved them. Just the venue, because it was like more, I don't know, the Cricketers was, it we could host things like African bands, because after Paul Simon had done his African album, a lot of those bands came to London and played, and Andy Kershaw on Radio 1 was pushing them, and Pete Lawrence and people like that. And so it was like a thing. And some venues, like, for example, the Bull and Gate, for example, or the Falcon in Camden, wouldn't really go down that route because it wasn't really suitable. But we could do it. And at the same time, we could have the UK subs on, and we could have like Alvin Crow, who was a Western swing guy from Texas.
Country music in a honky tonk with a dance floor made of wood. I guess I'm just too country for my own good.
So we had a very wide range, and we were very welcoming to lots of people. I mean, I can remember one night we had the S.E. Roji, who was like from Sierra Leone, who basically played folk songs in his own language. And then the next night we had on that Petrol Emotion, which was the band that John and Damien O'Neill had after they were in the Undertones, wrote all the songs, all the hits.
Holy rolling thinkers, need jerks and lovesick drinkers, I follow each other through the haze.
So it was very diverse, and then the next night we'd have Wilko Johnson on.
I don't know, I may be right, I may be wrong, but I bet you're gonna miss me when I'm gone.
That's part of it. Not every venue was the same. Like the Dublin Castle under Steve Beggs only really booked some music which he liked, like it was Red Beans and Rice and Diz and the Doorman and Juice on the Loose and that kind of thing. Whereas we had all those bands on, but we also had mixed it up, as I say, with the UK subs. So John Fat Beast tend to go for the indie, noisier stuff like I know Zodiac, Mind Warp and Crazy Head really enjoyed playing for him. They also enjoyed playing for me, but it's a different situation down there. At this point, can I just say, if you've not already subscribed, it would be a great help to me. And also, I believe, well, I'm not supposed to say this, but I was speaking to His Holiness the Pope, and he told me that people who subscribe to this channel maybe stand a little bit more chance, perhaps, of going up rather than down. Now, not saying this is just for Catholics. I think it applies to everybody. Not supposed to say, so don't pass it on, please. And keep it a bit quiet, eh? Anyway, that's subscribing. Like it if you like it, and share it with your friends. Comment, let me know what you think. Tell me about whether you think I've just been blasphemous. Blasphemous, yes.
Rule number 1, no blasphemy.
Basically, the way it worked was I booked the bands, say. I also advertised it, so we occasionally would spend some money on advertising. Now, normally what would happen was, at the weekend, say, you'd have like Wilko Johnson or Gina Washington, say, and they'd be typically on a guarantee of £400 or £500, or a percentage of the door take. For example, you'd be charging, say, £3, shall we say, to make it easy. The cricketers held 200 people, so if you had a full house, you'd have £600. Now, a lot of bands are on, well, this way, the better known and the better their agent, the band is, the more percentage they would get. The maximum was 90% paid to Morrissey Mullen, but that was another story because the landlord was a big fan of them, and that was part of the deal. That anyway, let's not go down there. But normally it would be like, I think Gina Washington was on at 75%, Steve Marriott was on 80%, I think Wilko Johnson was on at 70%. You'd be friendly with the bands, and also I was agent for all these bands as well, so I knew them personally. So you tend to, I mean, it was a very harsh person who say, if it came to, when we worked it out, it came to something like £449.86, who gave the band £489.86, instead of rounding it up to nearest £5 or £10. That's what you normally did. So you keep the band happy. You never really knew what was going to happen, because you had no internet or anything like that. So, but you tend to know that if you booked Wilko Johnson on a Friday night, say, that you would normally, at the Cricketers, sell out. If you booked him on a Friday night, say, at the Royal Standard, I believe that wasn't always the case, because he did better. Well, every act did better, as I alluded to earlier, about different venues being suitable for different things. Like, for example, in the Cricketers and the Half Moon Putney and places like that, heavy metal, you could not give you away. I can remember Thunder, because our sound man, Neil, was also the sound man for Thunder, who were rising, a local band from Blackheath, who were rising, and he said he could get them to play at the Cricketers. Now, normally, if they were playing at some like the Marquee, they would sell the Marquee out, which is like 2 or 3 times the size of the Cricketers. We booked Thunder. They were like in the music press, especially Sounds, because that specialised in the harder rock. And they were a bit more heavier than what we would normally have. Like, for example, bands like, when they were coming up, people like Saxon and Iron Maiden, I never had any success with at all. So anyway, Thunder, let's go back to that. And I think they pulled about 125, which is pretty good for Thursday night at the Cricketers. But for Thunder, it would have been terrible. Like at the Marquee, they would have done like 2 or 3 nights, if you know what I mean, and pulled like 500 people per night. So, you know, you just can't tell. You've got to bear in mind what else is going on. Like when the World Cup was on, because most of the people who went to gigs in the pub rock game, now say we like, this is true, I'd say that at least 70% of them would be men. So I'm not particularly a football fan, but I am aware that that most men are, actually, let's be fair about it. So during the World Cup, it would be terrible. If England were playing during the World Cup, you would have you'd be lucky to get in 30 people. Part of the job would be to find out when these things are going on. Like if there's an England football match that was live on the TV. Don't get back then, as I keep saying, no internet or anything, so it had to be on the TV. And I can remember once I was offered Laurel Aitken. On the first Friday of the World Cup. Now, Laurel Aitken would normally... Now, he never played at the Cricketer, so I was quite keen to have him. It was Gaz Mail, my friend, who was offering it. We were aware that it was the first Friday of the World Cup. I think England weren't playing or anything like that. I think it was Germany or Holland or something. It was live on the TV. It was the first one. Now, both Gaz and I decided that Laurel Aitken's power would be greater than people staying at home to watch Germany or France or whatever it was. So we went ahead and put him on. And I'm pretty sure it was just, because of the circumstances, it was just a straight dub percentage. It was the worst Friday night I ever had at the Cricketers for anyone, because it turned out that Laurel Aitken's fans, for some reason, all supported whoever it was who was playing. And I seem to remember we had 30 people to turn up. There's also a case which actually surprised me greatly, because I can remember I was off one night, and I can't remember what it was. It was a Tuesday or Wednesday night, and, well, I can't remember who it was who put it onto it. I think it was somebody I used to work with who ran a record label, and he said, there's this band coming down from the Midlands, can you put them on? In the Midlands, there was Big as Slade. Same kind of music. This was like early 80s, quite early on at my time at the Cricketers. So I booked them without knowing, and I don't remember their name. And I found out later that their name that they gave me was not their actual name. Anyway, I wasn't working that night, supposedly. I'm about to go out the pub. So I went down to, I think it was Keith was on the door, or it might have been Jay, the 2 guys that did the door for me, when the barman said, look out the window or something. And there were literally 100 people waiting to get in. So, cut a long story short, I basically decided not to go out and stay and to do the door. Well, I hoped to do the door. It turned out that this was a far-right band from the West Midlands. And so all the people who were outside were actually skinheads, and loads more turned up. It was actually packed. They apparently were trying to get out of this far-right thing. They were known for being a far-right band, but they were trying to do... And they did sound a bit like Slade, actually. And I can't remember their actual name. Something like the Force or something like that. So we had this situation where I discussed it with the landlord. My instinct, not being a far-right person at all, would have been to tell them to pack their bags and go. But you can't really do that. If you've got 200 or 300 people turn up to see a band and the people in the pub just told them to go, you're not going to have much of a pub left at the end of it. So we let them go ahead. They offered to come down again and do it again, but I had to say no.
It's definitely not a good time to be a Nazi.
Looking back on those days, it was exhausting because it was a 7-day-a-week job. And as I said, even when you had a night off, I went through a whole period when I worked every night for, I think, 2 or 3 years or something. People say, oh, no, you weren't here for this, what's that? When I wasn't working in the Cricketers, I'd be off on tour with Wilco Johnson in Ireland. And that definitely especially when you're doing Northern Ireland, and I could tell you a few stories about that. That was definitely not relaxing. Vans break down, we had financial... I mean, we got one stage where we couldn't afford to check out of a hotel because we didn't have enough money to check out the hotel. So we had to say we had to stay there, and then we had to drive to all these faraway places. It's happy days, eh? But it was like enjoyable because it was almost a social thing. It was very stressful in a way because, I mean, every day at least one or two things would go wrong. Very rarely double book bands, very rarely, but it happened from time to time, and normally it was worked out on the night that you either paid one off or you put them both on or something. It depends on the style of music. It was normally like the lower end bands who would be double booked, and wherever you could, you tried to put both of them on. But as the Cricketers was only open from 8 o'clock till 11, the headline bands normally traditionally did at least an hour, probably 90 minutes, and you had to have changeovers between the bands. You only realistically had an hour for the support band maximum, and that includes run-in, because they don't really want to put the support band on immediately the doors open, because sometimes you had, as I said, you had people waiting outside the door for you to open up. Other times, nobody literally turned up till 9. That was always nerve-wracking, because I'd be sitting at the door thinking, I've got to find, 400. And also occasionally the PA would break down. Quite often the engineer or whoever was there, or myself, quite often would be able to, or quite often somebody in the band, which is a godsend, or one of the roadies, would be able to mend it. Well, even actually cobble together something that would work long enough to do the show. So you had all these things going on. And at the time, I don't know, it was so exciting. I used to live in the pub, so literally we would finish work at, say, get everybody out by 11:30, and then perhaps the band would stay for a drink, especially at the weekends, or maybe just me and one of the barmen or whatever, we'd have a quick drink afterwards. And quite often it'd just be me and a couple of people, and we'd leave the money on the top of the till and a note of what we've had so it could be rung in the next day. Never took the piss, I'll be honest with you, because obviously it was part of the community, because everybody that worked there was part of it. That's the whole point with the... Well, we all used to know each other. Everybody who was doing it, like Boss Goodman at Dingwalls and Vince Power at Mean Fiddle and all these other venues. And there'd be Alan Robinson up at the T&C, and there'd be Ollie at the T&C again, his partner, and there'd be George Blevins, and there'd be Mick at the Half Moon, and Jonah, and Bill Knox. We'd all exchange notes, and quite often Bill Knox would say, have you heard of so-and-so band? They're doing really well for me at the King's Head, and I do the same for him. And because, it was all a thing, but we never realised it was so influential. I mean, it really was one of the most influential periods in British music, and I was very pleased to be there. Well, thank you for watching. Sorry if it was a bit boring, but hey, we're still here, aren't we? And you might want to watch this one next. Goodbye.